Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Really thankful for the introduction and for the invitation by Salaam for us to come and discuss such an important topic, which has been around for quite some time. I guess if you read the Bible, you would consider that the Middle East has been around for some time, and the conflicts have been there for a long period, at least maybe 2,000 years, if not before. If anything, it tells us that human beings are still able to create conflicts and disputes, and our role as possibly intellectuals and academics to try to find and untie the knots that have been sewn around, once again, the Middle East. First, let me say something about the immediate conflict. We wrongly describe this conflict as in the Israeli-Lebanese or Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think this is a wrong description of it. This description puts it or places the conflict to be only between the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Israelis and Lebanese, and not consider it in the wider context. I tend to define this conflict as being the United States, Israel, the Arab world that is allied with the United States and Israel against a particular configurations in the Middle East that continues possibly to resist a particular type of structure that is being proposed for the Middle East. This structure that is being proposed is defined by Secretary of State Rice as the New Middle East. When they speak of the New Middle East, now, this New Middle East is not really formulated with the people of the Middle East in mind. It's another structure to be set up at their expense, once again. And I would say from the onset that the primary reason and concern for developing this New Middle East is something that we are all familiar with. It's oil. When we speak of the New Middle East, is once again to reconfigure the region for access to resources, and the primary resource is oil. And we at least witnessed in the immediate past, the last month, the impact of instability on the price of oil going to $75 and $76 per barrel. And therefore, part of the dynamics of the New Middle East is once again to focus on the access to oil. And we often use the term, it's our oil. If you recognize this concept of our oil, and we look at the Middle East, at least the Middle East, as far as geographers are concerned, is not part of the 50 states, unless you have already incorporated the swaths of the Middle East into the United States. It's their oil, and it has to be considered how they would like to relate to the world in relations to trade and engage in transfer of resources in an equitable basis across many parts of the world. Now, I said that this war is not only an Israeli-Lebanese or Israeli-Palestinian war, that the United States is involved from the onset. The United States was involved in the Iraq war, meaning the United States has boots on the ground in Iraq. Part of the dynamics of the lead up to the war to Iraq was that the war in Iraq would provide possibly further security to Israel. At least we recognize that some components of the pro-Israel forces in the US were heavily in favor of the war in Iraq. And in Israel, the polling pre-Iraq war was one of the highest, possibly even higher than the US. Where some polls were in the 82 to 83 and some 85% of the Israeli public was in favor of the Iraq war for removing Saddam Hussein as a threat to Israel. And the United States entered into this conflict with this aspect of the removal of the threat to Israel in terms of Iraq. Now, the United States project, and I said this before the Iraq war, that if the United States succeeds in Iraq, then we definitely would have a new Middle East where Israel will be the leading component of it, being able to be incorporated into the configuration that we have in the Middle East. It's already struck a deal with Jordan for a peace process. Egypt is already neutralized relative to the peace process in the Camp David Agreement. The Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the GCC, where Saudi Arabia is the biggest component of it, already have normalized relations with Israel through the GCC. Israel has an office, commercial interest office in Qatar, for those who are unaware, and therefore there was a move in the Arab world for this normalization. So if the United States succeeded in Iraq, then we definitely would see that the United States, Israel, Arab regimes alliance for configuring the Middle East to their own benefit, with the primary concerns of trying to contain Iran in the near future, and Iraq was a stumbling block. However, my analysis before the war, that if the United States fails, and I said that the United States will fail in Iraq, because many of those who were formulating the plans for Iraq were ideologues that have no background whatsoever in what would it take to try to actually reconstruct the state after you destroy it. And therefore, the Iraq operation is a failure, and as such, there is a reconsideration of attempting to try to see how the US can either extricate itself or, once again, try to move to not a plan B, because they don't have a plan B, but a plan A plus. And the plan A plus is how to actually deal with shifting the blame or shifting the responsibility to Iran and Syria. Now, this was part of the thinking even before the Iraq war, of shifting the blame or seeing Iran and Syria as the next component or next possibility on the threat for the US, Israel, and the Arab regimes that were also on board with the United States. Now, if you look at the specificity relative to the current operation of Israel in Lebanon, which was on the heels of the operation that Israel has been conducting in the Gaza Strip, at least from the January 25th, when the election in Palestine resulted in a transformation of the political landscape in Palestine, with the winning of Hamas and coming of an Islamic organization into the governing structure in Palestine, something that was an earthquake in terms of the political landscape of the Middle East, unexpected by Hamas, unexpected by the Palestinian leadership, unexpected by the Israelis, and definitely the United States had no clue of what is taking place in relation to the Palestinian political process. The operation in Lebanon, and here we have to specify, has to be looked upon in relation to the containment strategy that is occurring relative to Iran. Iran cannot engage directly militarily against the US or Israel. Iran can engage in asymmetrical warfare, strategically. Asymmetrical warfare, meaning that they understand that the United States and Israel are the only two nuclear powers in the neighborhood. Meaning that Iran cannot engage in a conventional warfare against the configuration of forces around it, but it could engage in asymmetrical warfare. Part of the asymmetrical warfare that Hezbollah fits into this asymmetrical warfare. Before the US, and possibly also the discussion was of Israel engaging in some type of operation against Iran before Iran can fully develop its nuclear weapon, is for some type of a strike, some type of knocking out the nuclear program of Iran, in a similar way that the Iraqi nuclear program was attacked by the Israelis in the early 80s to knock out their nuclear development. However, if an attack on Iran occurs where Hezbollah is still vested and strong in the south part of Lebanon, the asymmetrical warfare of the Iranians will be mobilized in such a way to put pressure in Israel, as well as by extension, Iran could make things more difficult in Iraq, since the Iranians, possibly if you look at the strategic map in the Middle East, is the biggest victor relative to the Iraq operations. We managed to transfer Iraq into a Shia state. For me, that's not a problem. There's still Shia Arab state, Muslim state. For some, that might be seen as a problem. Iran also, in terms of its asymmetrical warfare, can engage in possibly closing the Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz, actually, that's where most of the oil that comes out of the Persian Gulf is transferred, and Strait of Hormuz is rather narrow. Pretty much the Iranians could actually set up two striking points on the Strait of Hormuz, and they would bring all oil shipping to a halt, and they could sink one tanker in the strait itself. That will take months for it to be reopened, and therefore, yes, the United States might be able to put pressure militarily and use its shock and awe against the Iranians, but in doing so, it will actually destabilize as much of the world economy, considering that a barrel of oil now is 76. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, prepare yourself to pay or to see the barrel of oil goes up to $300, $400, and possibly $500 if the Strait of Hormuz closed and all the oil resources are coming to a standstill. So this dynamic of attacking Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon in the larger operation fits into the containment strategy against Iran, which is the standing policy in the US is to contain the Iranian. That's been the case at least from the 80s during both Democrat and Republican, and this is actually a nonpartisan issue in terms of trying to contain the Iranian threat, in particular relative to the Arab regimes first and foremost, as well as the Israelis who see the increasing assertiveness of Iran and possibly the success of an Islamic revolution, an Islamic state that could be used as a model for other states to begin to see and to see as an alternative. This was the major reasons that the US opposed the Iranian Revolution of '79 and supported Iraq in its war against Iran at that point, because you do not want to have a success model of a revolution that managed to put a US ally out of business in terms of the Shah and allow them to succeed, and therefore that has to be reversed. And the biggest threat of the Iranian Revolution at the time, and continues to be today, is directed against the Arab monarchy structures, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, who are our major suppliers of oil relative to our economy, even though we don't get the oil directly from the Middle East, about 25%, but our oil infrastructure has to be expanded, that the Chinese oil resource that is being brought from the Middle East is also for our own economy. Because at least China produces most of the commodities that we are using, and in our thinking of oil, not only the oil that we use, but the oil that we consume through directly or indirectly, and China has to be fitted into this discussion. If you look in the Israeli thinking, Hezbollah took 2 soldiers, and that's an issue right now that still is for debate. I know some Israeli lawyers and some American lawyers are trying to see if they could file a lawsuit against the Lebanese for compensation, asserting that Hezbollah actually crossed the blue line into Israel. Hezbollah says that they crossed, or they took the 2 soldiers from the Shab'a farms, and the Shab'a farms are properties or territories that belong to Lebanon according to 1949 armistice agreement at the end of the 1948 war, and therefore they consider that to be an occupied area. And the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers who were killed in pursuit of the Hezbollah commandos who took the Israeli soldiers into Lebanese territory, and they were killed in Lebanese territory. But being the issue as it may be, the response of the Israelis was already planned beforehand. The plan has been actually in the work for about 6 years in terms of how to strike Hezbollah, how to roll Hezbollah back. The planning was undertaken for some time, and the failure in the Israeli plan is that it's heavily dependent on air power. Today's Haaretz actually had an interesting title for their article on the front page, the day after how we suffered a knockout. That in Israel itself, they're seeing this as a defeat, even though that many of the spin doctors, including the one in the White House, is saying that Israel have registered a victory. In Israel itself, they're recognizing this as a defeat. Why? Because if you look at the goals that were set by the Prime Minister Olmert, which is a complete destruction of Hezbollah, removal of Hezbollah from the south, the release of the 2 soldiers, and possibly deployment of an international force from the United Nations that is different than the UNIFIL, which is the international force that has been there since the 1978, we see that all these goals were not accomplished. One, if you look at the United Nations ceasefire, even though that the language massage, it did not actually order for the immediate release of the 2 soldiers. So Hezbollah actually still has the 2 soldiers with them. They did not release it. Second, they have been unable to destroy Hezbollah. If anything, if you look at the numbers, in terms of the number of Israeli soldiers that have been confirmed killed or injured, compared to the Hezbollah forces that have been killed or injured, the ratio is the opposite. Meaning there are more Israeli soldiers that were killed and injured in the operation versus the Hezbollah, even though that there is an attempt in Israel to say that they killed 200 Hezbollah fighters. And even if you take that figure as a fact, it's actually a 1-to-2 ratio. Most of the casualties on Lebanese sides were civilian casualties. And the use of the overwhelming force, rather than to cause a neutralization and possible hostilities in Lebanon toward Hezbollah, it actually led to an encirclement in Lebanon and the Lebanese asserting their nationalist identity and seeing this as actually a resistance operation and an operation that asserted their own sovereignty even while the destruction that has been visited upon them. So rather than contain Hezbollah in Lebanon, it actually increased its presence and credibility. And second, Hezbollah was an organization with 1,500, possibly if you take the most expansionist intelligence report on Hezbollah, Hezbollah had about 5,000. This is with the most generous intelligence report. It says it has 5,000 trained guerrilla fighters. Some of the more limited, it says it has about 1,500. It withstood an Israeli attack for possibly 32 days. And managed to inflict a response to the Israeli military, that the Israeli military right now have lost much of its standing as a force in the greater Middle East. And if you know military strategy is not about how much pain and suffering you could cause your opposition. It is how much fear can you induce in your opposition that they